Hi guys, Mrs. Karaz here. Today we are starting Chapter 19, Political Reform and the Progressive Era, and we begin with Section 1, the Gilded Age and Progressive Reform. Alright, so the period after the Civil War was called the Gilded Age. And if you're saying, wait, what? The period after the Civil War, which was the chapter we ended with last year? Yes, correct. The textbook jumps around a lot in time to try and group things thematically. Stay with me. But back to the Gilded Age. So when something is gilded, it is covered in a thin layer of gold paint, right? So it looks shiny and beautiful and sparkly, but really there's just this thin layer of paint that could easily be scratched off and chipped to reveal the not-so-prettiness that's underneath. So this time period was called the Gilded Age because everything seemed golden and wonderful, but actually there was trouble, right? Some people feared that industrialists and big businesses were profiting at the expense of the public, right? Big businesses had too much control and the people were suffering. Some people worried about corruption and dishonesty in government. Again, the people in power abusing it and the little guy struggling. So we're going to see some reforms in this chapter that try to deal with these issues. All right, so one such issue, a big one, was the spoils system. In the spoils system, political supporters are given government jobs that they didn't earn as thanks for their loyalty and support, right? And people wanted to be rewarded, right? If I'm being kind to someone, maybe they'll do me a favor, maybe they'll do me a job, give me a job. So if we're thinking about the spoil system, I like to think about spoiled children, like that helps me remind it. So if, it's you and your brother talking about, your mom's fried chicken that she makes, I don't know, and your brother says that your mom's fried chicken is the most amazing in the world, and you say, well, KFC is better. And then your brother gets an extra scoop of ice cream for dessert that night. Your mom has spoiled him for being on her side, right? So we're giving people things they didn't earn just because they've been loyal to the people in power. So looking at some ways that the spoils system played out. We've got President James Garfield, who was inaugurated in 1881. And many people who had supported him came to him seeking jobs under the spoils system, right? And it's important to note that the spoils system is not it's not a legal thing. It's not something that anyone would discuss openly and publicly. It's kind of a secret thing that goes on. One man that sought a job from President Garfield was Charles J. Guiteau. He wasn't given a job, and so he assassinated Garfield. So, needless to say, bad. Spoils system not doing good things here. After Garfield died, Vice President Chester A. Arthur became the president. And he had really worked up the political ranks thanks to the spoils system itself in large part. But ultimately Arthur came to feel that the spoils system was wrong, and we'll see what he intended to do about it. Well, here it is. So in 1883, Arthur signed the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act created the Civil Service Commission, which aimed to give government jobs to people who deserve them, right? Fairly straightforward. Civil service includes most government jobs, except elected officials, the judiciary, and the military. And thanks to the Pendleton Act, civil service exams started being given, right? And the people who scored highest on those exams were given the jobs. So I'm thinking off the top of my head, I'm from Long Island, and I know that it's very competitive to enter the police force there. So there are certain tests that you have to go through. You need to get a certain number on these tests before you could even be considered to be a police officer, right? It's a similar concept. All right, moving on to the issues revolving around big business. So big businesses like railroads and steel use their money to gain power in the government, with many offering bribes to get politicians to help pass the laws that they wanted, right? And this was kind of hard to control for a while, but the Constitution gives the government the power to control trade between states. So, since many of these industries had an influence in that world, right, where you're trading between states, there are some laws we could put into place that might be helpful. In 1887, President Grover Cleveland passed the Interstate Commerce Act. And this ended the system of rebates where the government was, giving things to the railroad companies for laying down more tracks. We'd seen that in a previous chapter. And it set up the Interstate Commerce Commission to keep an eye on railroads and making sure that they were, not trying to take advantage of consumers or the government. In 1890, President Benjamin Harrison passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this stopped businesses from limiting or destroying their competition, right? We saw that was one of the complaints against trusts last chapter. And this law sounded really tough, but it was hard to enforce, especially because many judges sided with big business, right? They didn't think it was the government's role to interfere in privately owned businesses, running back to that laissez-faire economics principle, right? And possibly one of the worst things about the Sherman Antitrust Act was that it was actually used against unions, right? So judges said if you went on strike, if your union went on strike and you refused to work, well, that means no product could come from your company, and that means that there are fewer options for the consumer, right? You are threatening free enterprise by going on strike. You're giving the consumer fewer options. How dare you? You are breaking a law. Doesn't seem so logical to us today, but that's how they spun it back then. All right, moving on to some more reforms. We've got the Wisconsin idea. So this all originated, shockingly, in Wisconsin, and it started with Governor Robert La Follette, who was nicknamed Battling Bob. He introduced some progressive reforms that ultimately became known as the Wisconsin idea. So, progressives in Wisconsin wanted to reform the government so that the interests of the public were always given priority, right? We want the people to have a voice, the ordinary citizens, not just the people in power. So, in order to take power away from big businesses, La Follette created commissions of experts to help solve problems in specific fields. So, for example, there's the Railroad Commission, and that's in charge of monitoring railroads and making sure their rates are low or at least fair. Wisconsin also begins using political primaries at this time. And during a primary, voters choose the candidate for their party. We do this today, right? Many of you might have watched recent political primaries on the news. And when there are primaries, right, the people get to choose who the candidate that will be running for their own party, and that means the power is in their hands. The spoils system is limited. Looking at some other reforms that brought more power for voters. So recall is a process that allows people to vote in order to remove someone from political office. This makes it easier for voters to get rid of corrupt officials. Once someone has been elected, you could kind of call them back out. Another reform is initiative, which is a process that allows voters to propose a bill before the state legislature. And this means voters are going directly to the state legislature without having to go through elected officials. And last but not least, we have referendum, a process for people to vote directly on a proposed law. This allows voters to decide which bills do or do not become laws. And again, it's the voters having the choice, not just their representatives that they've elected. All right, so moving on. So many progressives at this time supported a graduated income tax. Oh, I turned my radio on, but now I'm going to turn it off. Maybe I did. Okay. So a graduated income tax means that people are taxed at different rates depending on their income. If you earn more, you're taxed more, right? Repeating what I just said, the wealthy would be expected to pay a higher rate than the middle or lower class. Originally, the Supreme Court decided that a graduated income tax was unconstitutional, so we get some amendments. The 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and it gave Congress the power to pass an income tax. So, more power for that purpose. The 17th Amendment was also ratified in 1913, and this required that senators be directly elected by the people who live in their states. Representatives could not choose who new senators would be. The people themselves have to choose. And this limits corruption that came when state legislatures elected senators. Things like bribery, things like the spoils system, they're gone because now it's the people's choice. And last but not least for today, muckraking. So muckrakers were journalists who looked to expose corruption and problems in government or businesses. And Theodore Roosevelt is the one that gave muckrakers this nickname because they always wanted to rake up the dirt on people who held power, he said. So some famous muckrakers that we'll look at closely. Ida Tarbell was a muckraker who opposed trusts, and she wrote a lot of pieces against Rockefeller Standard Oil Trust. Jacob Riis was a writer and a photographer and a muckraker who exposed problems in the slums. When we go to the Tenement Museum, typically they show some photographs by Jacob Riis. And last but not least, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed problems in the meatpacking industry and brought along some reforms that we will see in the next section. But that is it for today. So we'll freeze here. Hope you guys have a great afternoon. Bye.